The next panel is going to include Mariusz Kałczewiak and Amelia Glaser. Mariusz from the University of Potsdam. He did his degree in Tel Aviv, and he has written a dissertation on Polish Jews in Argentina, and has a book coming out shortly with the University of Alabama Press. I think I got that right? And Mariusz is going to speak about the red fields of Ukraine. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to speak to next to Amelia. And what I'm going to present today is a section of my larger research project on Perets Hirshbeyn. It's still a work in progress, and I will just present my initial findings concerning just a fraction of Hirshbeyn's work. And for those who are less familiar with Perets Hirshbeyn, just a few words of introduction. Perets Hirshbeyn was born in 1880 in Polish-Lithuanian borderlands, and is most well known as a playwright. His Hirshbeyn troupe was one of the most successful theater ensembles in Eastern Europe in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1914, Hirshbeyn settled in New York, and his plays staged there were great artistic and commercial success. And my second book project is supposed to be kind of like intellectual biography of Perets Hirshbeyn. Sets out to explore the less known facets of Hirshbeyn's work as a travel writer, as Yiddish culturalist, and a public intellectual. And one of the still unexplored aspects of Hirshbeyn works is travel writing. Hirshbeyn traveled widely in the 1920s, visiting places such as Australia, Japan, China, Myanmar, Palestine, Soviet Russia, etc. And the travelogues and the travel articles which he published reveal his sharp cultural and social critique, and as well Hirshbeyn political preferences. And this is what Amelia was telling yesterday. It was very much illuminating for me, because I'm like today trying to look at the Hirshbeyn's travel to Soviet Ukraine as a kind of perspective which shows me to what extent he was communist, to what extent he was a left winger, to what extent he was criticizing social reality. And today I will talk about Hirshbeyn's trip in southern Ukraine, in Kherson area and Crimea. Hirshbeyn arrived in Ukraine in 1928 and stayed there for several months. Just to give you a couple of interesting images of how he looked in Ukraine. This is Hirshbeyn. During his visit to Ukraine, it was the only time in his life when we see him without his amazing hair. This is I guess he got some kind of skin disease here. But anyway, this is Hirshbeyn and Shkandrij in the agricultural colonies in Crimea, close to Equatoria. Vineyards in Crimea with the Jewish settler. Again, a picture of the Ukrainian steppe. And I guess here it's again Equatoria and just enjoying the beach. Coming on his way to Ukraine, Hirshbeyn stayed briefly in Moscow, and then headed south, accompanied by his life companion Shkandrij, and initially also by a Russian Yiddish poet, Vaad. Altogether, Hirshbeyn spent in the Soviet Union about a year. So we can, if you come here for a year, it's not a short visit, right? He actually lived here for some time. And being in Soviet Russia, he was publishing travel articles, being simultaneously published in Warsaw Moment, in the Talk in New York, and depressing Buenos Aires. In 1930, Hirshbeyn published some of his travel articles in a book titled Schwarzbruch, 10 Chodoshim et Jiddische Überwanderer in Crimea, 10 months with the Jewish settlers in Crimea. In 1926 for another book, USSR, published in Vilna. And in 1936 another book, a fictional book, Royte Felder, The Red Fields. And I will talk today just about the Schwarzbruch, a volume which refers specifically to agricultural colonization in Crimea, and it's a kind of like auto-ethnographic account, I would say, because it's a Jewish writer exploring the experiences of his fellow Jews. And it's interesting for me, like what brings Hirshbeyn to Crimea, right? How come American Jewish writer suddenly finds this interest in this Soviet project? And as I said, I'm searching for this for like this political motivations, which I hope to see. In 1929, when Hirshbeyn was in Crimea, Crimea had already more than 100 Jewish villages, and the idea of Jewish agricultural colonization seemed very, very attractive to Western left-wing Jewish activists. And New York Forward sent to Soviet Union its chief editor, A. Kahan, and other writers such as Israeli Joshua Singer and David Nomberg also participated in research expeditions to Soviet Union. And this enthusiasm was, of course, obviously linked to the concept of reconstructing the Eastern European Jewish economy, making Jews productive. And the Soviet Jewish colonization project corresponded with analogous initiatives in Palestine, Argentina, and on a lesser scale in USA and Canada. Of course, and Hirshbeyn was very much aware of this other centers that he also explored them during his travels. So Gennady Estreich argued that Hirshbeyn tried to maintain a middle position, not voicing his support for left-wing, not voicing his support for right-wing, and in the end that he was a liberal Jewish nationalist who dreamed of creating an optimal setting for the Yiddish nation. And I would suggest that Hirshbeyn travelogue reveals Hirshbeyn's pro-communist stand. He marvels the revolution and its transformative and liberating power. Hirshbeyn was very much supportive of Jewish agricultural settlement in Ukraine and saw communism as an end to the Tsarist oppression of the Jewish minority. He writes of revolution as being logical, as being, I quote, a warm hand who leads the persecuted, defending them and announcing a new better world. Hirshbeyn was very much supportive of a collectivized spirit of collective work introduced by communism, and he appreciated the drive for a social change among local Jewish youth whose, again quote, hot blood is filling their veins and who are born out of blood and fire. So you see, like, he incorporates this kind of revolutionary language as well. At the same time, Hirshbeyn didn't avoid picturing darker sides of Jewish colonization in Crimea. He did write about numerous settlers leaving the colony soon after their arrival, about hunger, hardships, problematic relations between the settlers and the administrators of Jewish colonization institutions. But to sum it up, it wasn't only the improved status of Yiddish language and culture which Hirshbeyn appreciated in Soviet Union, but it was also the social, cultural, and economic transformation that Jews experienced in Soviet Crimea. Hirshbeyn's writing is very much anthropological. He attempts to analyze and understand the reasoning of people who decided to resettle in Crimea. Hirshbeyn settles in Crimea for several months in an attempt, again quote from his work, to at least partially experience the suffering and happiness. He almost includes himself in the category of Jewish settlers. He wants to offer a full picture of colonization, to write of our weaknesses and strengths, where our means our Jewish, meaning Hirshbeyn's and of the settlers. A Crimean colonist felt a certain proximity to the Jewish writer. They trusted him and wanted to show him the new lives. The settlers acknowledged Hirshbeyn's position as a both internal and external actor, as a person who is indeed interested in their lives, but who, in the end, who doesn't fully share the experiences. Hirshbeyn divides colonists into optimists who truly believe in the transformation of Jewish life through colonization, and into the pessimists who use the presence of the author to complain about the everyday struggles and doubts concerning the immigration to Crimea. And this is Hirshbeyn who is cataloging, who is categorizing these experiences of Jewish settlers. And he looks at diverse groups of people, at men and women, old and young, and conducts with them what sociologists would call in-depth interviews, and then retelling them in a form of what he calls monologue, and not his monologue, but monologue of his object of his investigation. For Hirshbeyn, the agricultural colonization wasn't only a social engineering project coordinated by the Soviet government. He saw it also very much as a kind of remedy for anti-Semitism and post-pogrom traumas. And this is, it's again what refers to what you were saying yesterday. The pogroms which followed the revolution are an omnipresent element in the narrative of Jewish settlers. Hirshbeyn in detail elaborates on the pogrom in Fasti, a town close to Kiev. The former residents have difficulties in rebuilding their lives when recognizing in their neighbors the murderers of their families. And only the migration to Crimea is a kind of, this is like the only thing that would allow them to regain their mental health. The northern areas of Soviet Ukraine and Belarus seem to Hirshbeyn to be bloodlands, and only migration to Crimea, a southern paradise without much tradition of anti-Jewish violence, could help the pogrom victims to recover their mental stability and rebuild their lives. Hirshbeyn transmits these convictions via retelling the narrative of a young girl who saw her family murdered by the Ukrainians, but now has hopes for a new coexistence between both nations. Other female settler says that what area was her heim or home, meaning the shtetl, lost for her any importance following the pogroms. And she says, I want to forget about my shtetl. The steppe can also be a heim. Other immigrants also fell in love with the Crimean steppe. Another quote, not as one loves his home, but how one falls in love with samba. And this immigrant, in her narrative, he turned her back to the ruins of shtetl. It's also interesting to look on how Hirshbeyn positioned himself within Ukrainian-Jewish settlers and what identities and roles they impose on him. The settlers refer to Hirshbeyn in a threefold way, so it's either Haver Amerikaner, Tavarish Amerikaner, or Haver Hirshbeyn. And they perceived him as a kind of intermediary between them and the American Jews who supported the agro-joint settlements. From one side, the settlers do want that Hirshbeyn would tell the states about the misery and unprofessional work of the colonization institutions, but at the same time they feel ashamed that Hirshbeyn would besmirch abroad the new Soviet revolutionary homeland. The Jews with whom Hirshbeyn talks very much identify with the progress that the Soviet government promised to deliver. Some settlers claim that they enjoy more freedom than they would do in America. One of the colonists said, "Die Melucha ist mit uns," the state is on our side, and used it kind of like an argument, just justifying the new Soviet order. For some colonies, Hirshbeyn was when visiting the villages covered in the Crimean dust but still walking in an elegant suit, looks like an agronomist, a symbol of educated group of people assisting the settlers of agriculture. Hirshbeyn couldn't be perceived as an agricultural settler, but the colonists easily imagined him as an agronomist. And this association is very pleasant for Hirshbeyn, who, thanks to his own background, claims to have a certain knowledge in agriculture. Hirshbeyn is very much supportive of the Soviet attitude, which in those years, in the late 1920s, at least officially attempted to eradicate the anti-Semitism in Soviet Russia. Some Jewish settlers see the Soviet government as the only in the world to actively combat the anti-Semitism. And Hirshbeyn is very much aware that the increased Jewish presence in Crimea leads to an increased anti-Semitic sentiments among non-Jewish population. The Jews were accused by non-Jewish farmers of bringing droughts, snowstorms, and other natural disasters. But the fact that Russian state limited its anti-Semitic policies is very much appreciated by Hirshbeyn. Jews who were earlier weren't recognized as equal citizens now can serve in public offices, and as one of the settlers said, Jews got back their voice. Hirshbeyn was aware that anti-Semitism was still very much present in Soviet Russia, but it had less state recognition than in the Tsarist times. And he shows it, for example, like showing a scene when Jewish settlers could openly demand that, from a policeman to persecute non-Jewish neighbors who incited against the Jews. Crimean nature is pictured by Hirshbeyn as very challenging and harsh. Even though Crimea, in the perception of many colonists from the north, was a year-long summer region, in Hirshbeyn narrative, local nature is presented as extremely challenging. Hirshbeyn, in a kind of like Orientalist way, casts Crimea as an unbearably hot and unknown space. He historicizes the region's unusual character by referring to Ottoman times, presumed sexual orgies, feudal social relations, and exaggerated luxury of Crimean rulers. And Hirshbeyn is very aware that aware of the cultural context in which Crimea was approached in literature. It was seen as our, as close and nearby exotic space. Crimea, to some settlers, seems almost as exotic, as remote, as hot as the land of Israel. It was, in the perception of the settlers, it was like Crimea was the place from where they were receiving the etrogim and lulavim for high holidays. And next to its pogrom-free history, its mild climate, protecting from the cold and hunger. These were the attracting powers of Crimea. But at the same time, Crimea is pictured as a wild space with barely any human presence. The settlers suffered sleeping under open sky in fear of wild animals. When building their houses, they needed to sleep in cold and primitive dugouts. And initially, the steppe was a foreign space that needed to be domesticated. One of the settlers said, "In this foreign world, no tree, no river, no sign where is left and where is right. This is how I immersed in the nature. She gripped me. It was a scary time." Hirshbeyn also writes extensively on an unusually harsh winter which hit Crimea in 1928, and the snow and ice in his narrative contrasted very much with the images of warm Crimean paradise. And I think it functioned kind of as a kind of maturity test, a kind of like initiation ritual, which settlers needed to pass in order to domesticate Crimean nature and claim the belonging to Crimea. Hirshbeyn is very much supportive of the idea of physically active life, which was supposed to improve the health of former Jewish city dwellers. And he reassures himself by directly asking Jewish villagers if they would ever want to return to the pre-revolutionary society. An older settler is very surprised with this question and answers, quote, "Which Jew would want that the old order should return? A crazy man or someone without the slightest idea. To ask a Jew in the Soviet Union such a question is almost an insult." The settler is proud of the Jewish village he lives in, of the Jewish autonomy in governing the village via a village council. Hirshbeyn is using very pompous, very big words to describe the transformation of the Jewish life by agriculture. And he writes of an Iberbruch, a breakthrough. The old Jewish way of life, what he calls an outdated Lebenssteiger of a shtetl merchant, of a shtetl shopkeeper, is according to traveler dying out, without raising too much sadness or sympathy. The traces of this former shtetl Lebenssteiger are still visible. Many colonies are still wearing shtopische malbushim, urban clothing, and at least externally look still connected to the town. Hirshbeyn is convinced that the implementation of equal rights for Jews, granting them the status equal with other ethnic groups, can be done only by promoting Jewish farming. And this is a condition to making Jews equal. Hirshbeyn shows that the establishment of Jewish farming colonies as a brave and needed step towards Jewish liberation. He even compares the resettlement in Crimea to a biblical story of Jews leaving the exile in Egypt and arriving in the land of Israel. So in this metaphor, it's Crimea that appears as the land of Israel. Talking about the resettlement, Hirshbeyn often uses botanical agricultural metaphor. He writes of Überpflanzen, of the transplantation of people, which is a difficult social process, but which still has a potential for being a basis for a new better life. At the same time, the transplantation means that the building a new life should to be a certain extent rooted in the former life. So in that way, Hirshbeyn wants, to appreciate the transformation that the settlers experience, but he still insists on having a certain link to the pre-revolutionary Jewish life. An important feature visible in many other Hirshbeyn works is the relation between humans and earth. Hirshbeyn writes that Jewish peasants began to live in a full shutfest, in a full partnership with the earth that is becoming the mother. This relation is something which a city dweller dependent only from his own work would never understand. The Jewish peasants, the new Jewish peasants, need to learn how to cooperate with nature, to have it on its side. Hirshbeyn suggests that the Jewish settlers are impatient, do not take enough time to learn to work hand in hand with nature. And Crimean nature tests its new inhabitants, is unfriendly and sometimes cruel. The steppe, the flat area with no trees, seemed otherworldly to most of the settlers, and they didn't know how to heat their houses, and the steppe was to them friend, was a foreign space. And the time was needed to make it holy and livable. For a fervent supporter of Yiddish culture, the efforts at establishing Soviet Yiddish culture were very much welcomed by Perets Hirshbeyn. Many Jewish villages in Crimea were named not only after communist dignitaries, but also celebrated Yiddish authors, thus serving as a recognition of Yiddish culture by the Soviet authorities. Hirshbeyn visited a place called Sholem Aleichem, and one of the villages he personally named Perets Velt in order to honor Lieutenant Perets. While in some older Jewish villages established in Crimea in the 19th century, where most of the inhabitants were Russified, new Soviet villages appear appear as a kind of very much Yiddish space, like space full of Yiddish language. And this is a case in a village called Sade Menuches, which following the revolution was renamed into Kalinindorf, where young Jews spoke Yiddish again, benefiting from the pro-minority language policy supported by the government. At the same time, Hirshbeyn is not sure to what extent the new official Soviet Yiddish culture can be inclusive of pre-revolutionary or non-revolutionary cultural contents. Most of the Jewish children living in a village where poet Semyon Fruk was born do not know at all who he was. Hirshbeyn believed that the revolution is wrongly based on forgetting and denial. For some Jews, the empowerment of, for some Jews in the colonies, the empowerment of Yiddish language and culture, as Hirshbeyn suggests, was something surprising. They were never invested in defining their own culture as something worth public attention and celebration. Only the Soviet state pushed them to recognize Yiddish culture as something worth developing. Hirshbeyn's life in the Tsarist Russia was for him a constant reference point. Russia before 1914 was, according to the traveler, invested in instilling anti-Jewish hatred. The anti-Jewish measures, including the ban on Jews owning land, was for Hirshbeyn a Dernidrikung, a humiliation. And even though the settlers see him as an American, his Americanness wasn't that stable. His Russian roots allowed him to travel via Ukraine Crimea as a quasi-local. He even translated for Russian speakers who participated in the Jewish festivities several Yiddish speeches. Hirshbeyn recalled that when leaving Vilna in 1914 for New York, he felt that Hirshbeyn, a catastrophe, was approaching Russia. And when comparing the anti-Jewish oppression during the last years of the Tsarist Empire with the post-revolutionary world, it was for Hirshbeyn just almost impossible to comprehend. He couldn't, it was something so new to him that now Jewishness can be openly celebrated and villages named after Sholem Aleichem can be established. He was amazed that Jews could be state functionaries responsible not only for Jewish efforts, but having an equal part in the state apparatus. I will start to my conclusion. So, what bothers Hirshbeyn is in the Crimean Jewish colonies is the unreflective support for the regime and blind love for communism. One of the children asked by Hirshbeyn answers him that Lenin was the best person in the history of humanity. Hirshbeyn sympathizes with an old settler who wants to continue to pray using his tefillin, but is ridiculed by his community. And the religion is a sphere of conflict between old and young generations. The young ones educated in communist schools, members of the Komsomol, laugh at the older family members who continue believing in God and continue blessing the Shabbat. Older ones think that their children would become simple farmers and will lose any link to the Jewish tradition of learning. And whereas Hirshbeyn appreciated that the Jews developed a political consciousness, allowing them to understand that the Soviet government granted them political equality, they never experienced in Tsarist Russia. He wasn't sure if the settlers can independently assess the reality and be critical concerning the propaganda. Some of the colonists want that Hirshbeyn should present the colonization in a positive light abroad. And one of them says to him, tell in America that we are doing well. At the same time, Hirshbeyn himself is using vocabulary borrowed from the revolutionary language. He writes of reakcji, of kulaks, etc. And I argue that Hirshbeyn sees the Überwanderung, the resettlement, the Jewish resettlement in Crimea, also in a broader philosophical context. The resettlement is not only the experience of Jews in Crimea, it is a story, it's a broader story of social and cultural emancipation. He writes, quote, "We are the settlers, those who leave the thick, shady forest of old generations and enter the white steppe, bathing in the summery sunshine." The story of Jewish settlers in Crimea can be read not only in a context of Jewish emancipation. It is a story of universal story of migration and striving for freedom. And Hirshbeyn had a similar pro-liberation attitude also in other geographic contexts, as colonized India or colonized Africa. He wishes that the Jews would understand their position within other discriminated nations and would lead the struggle for a better and just world. While it might sound naive, this was Hirshbeyn, a Yiddishist who dreamt of a better world for Jews and other nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Amelia Glaser, does not need an introduction. You've already been introduced to her twice. And she will talk to us also about Crimea as an international Jewish homeland. Yiddish Poetic Portrayals of Crimea.
Thank you so much, Mariusz, for this really wonderful, stimulating presentation. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you about Crimea and about the Shumyacher Hirshbeyn family and their time in Crimea. I'm excited about this, so please right between our two talks. I guess I need my talk. Okay, so as before, I've changed my title very slightly to one that's maybe a bit more provocative or more unexpected. This, by the way, is the passport that Esther Shumyacher and Perets Hirshbeyn used to travel the world. I think it's cool that in the 1920s you could have a passport with two pictures together on it. A young Jewish giant roams Crimea in the Soviet Yiddish poet Chana Levin's 1929 Crimean motifs. Anaki, a literary descendant of the Anakim, a biblical tribe of giants, longs to transform the Crimean landscape. So she writes, and this is Chana Levin, he would lift these mountains and would ask for more. Wollte Bild gehoben und wollt gebeten noch. In Perets Margish's epic revolutionary poem Brothers, Bizel, which he wrote between 1927 and 1929, a Chinese Bolshevik gets lost in Crimea's vineyards. Esther Shumyacher, a North American visitor to the USSR who happened to be married to Perets Hirshbeyn, wrote ecstatically from Crimea in 1928. Die ganze Welt ist geworden, die ganze Welt geworden ist mein Chavel, von Yamses Tolen und Durst von Indias heiße Pläne, right? The whole world has become my comrade from the Yamses valleys and the thirst of India's hot plains. In these poems, all of which appeared in the late 1920s in the Kharkiv-based Yiddish journal Royte Velt, the Crimean Peninsula is a mythical space that conjures unlikely wanderers, outsiders who seek a physical and ideological home. It is simultaneously Jewish and foreign, and I'm excited to have this panel as an opportunity to expand just a little bit on the internationalism theme that I introduced a bit yesterday. In the late 1920s, Crimea was at the epicenter of the Soviet Jewish world. Jews had been forming farming colonies, and Mariusz has just spoken a bit about this, in Crimea since 1923. And this was a migration that was formalized when, in 1924, the Committee for the Settlement of Toiling Jews on the Land, Komzit, began creating collective farms for Jews and resettling families from the former shtetls. By 1928, thousands of Jews had relocated to the peninsula. Crimea was a bridge between east and west, a border zone with access to the Azov and Black Seas, and I appreciate the map that Mariusz gave all of us, and a region that could, like Palestine, mobilized supporters of a Jewish autonomous territory. It was also a significant geopolitical conquest for the nascent Soviet Union in the Russian Civil War. The decisive 1920 siege of Perets led to the Bolshevik seizure of the peninsula. Jewish organizations outside the USSR, including the American Joint Agricultural Cooperation, AgroJoint, envisioned Crimea as a future site for an autonomous Jewish region, a Soviet homeland for Jews in the wake of the revolution. Jews traveled from around the world to visit the colonies. Dozens of families emigrated from Palestine to work the Crimean lands. The Soviet Jewish dream of Crimea was part of this broader internationalist vision, one that aimed to eventually replace national collective identities with a proletarian identity, but that worked to foster Marxist-Leninism within individual, nationally defined groups as a means to this end. So within the USSR, Korenizatsiya, indigenization, had shaped Soviet nationalities policy since 1924, and this granted autonomous regions to ethnic groups in or near their historic homelands. You had to have a homeland to be a nation. It depended on land. In an effort to be recognized as a nation with a territory, Yiddish writers wove a new mythology of a Jewish Soviet internationalist land of milk and honey. So I'm gonna introduce three Yiddish poets. These three Yiddish poets who placed Crimea at the very center of a Yiddish proletarian world-building project. All three published their work in Royte Velt in the late 1920s and presented Crimea as a home for outsiders, Jews and other national outsiders. So I'm going to turn next to Perets Markish's Bride, or one section of his Bride that he pre-published before the entire poem came out. And then I'll talk a bit about Levin and finally about Schumacher. So as these three examples will show, the unrealized dream of a Jewish Crimea offers a kind of case study in communist myth-making, in which an autonomous territory contributes to an international ethos. And I understand the utopian visions of these Crimea poems as a version of what Feng Che has described as a worlding project. Literature opens, this is Che, literature opens a world because it magically gives a world or makes one appear in the imagination in a manner similar to evocation or conjuration, end quote. Che, who uses world as a verb, right, to world something, I don't know how I would translate that into Russian or Velten, I guess, in Yiddish. He focuses on post-colonial literature, but the model helps us to explain how much was at stake in the literature of Soviet national minorities who were compelled to envision a place for their ethnic groups within the context of a changing revolutionary world. We also have to consider how the revolution inspired writers across languages to aestheticize cross-national encounters. By the late 20s, writers were increasingly compelled to conform to Stalin's mandate that literature be national in form and proletarian in content. But as Nadav Foundation has observed, that very national form was the last sanctuary of modernist strangeness. Really important work that Skakov is doing, I believe. The Yiddish poets who described Crimea in the 1920s were not writing from a Russocentric perspective. Rather, by orientalizing their portrayals of the peninsula, Levin, Markish, and Schumacher imagine a homeland that is both Jewish and multinational, a Jewish-led microcosm of the Soviet Union. So I'm going to say a few brief things about each one. Hannah Levin's Crimean motifs centers on Anaki, one of a new generation of youths like oaks, Jungen wie Demben, strong and labor-loving. Anaki is related to the biblical Anakim, giants residing in Canaan. Capable of swimming the seas, he is ready to settle on land. And this is the first quote up here. Noch wie viel kann man schwimmen über Yam dem Schwarzen? How long can one swim over the Black Sea? Home to Jewish communities dating back to the 14th century, Crimea offered enough Jewish history to spawn a poetry of mythical return. Yet Anaki is burdened by the trauma of his more recent past. His father was a peddler who, this is the second quote, gesungen auf dem Wogen in Crimea, gebenchten Land von Rosenkes und Mandeln. He sang on the wagon in blessed Crimea of raisins and almonds. The father is akin, in his retrograde great understanding of world power and exchange, to the king in Livadia, in that he, quote, didn't learn to work, but went to buy and sell. But nicht gelernt Arbeit ist man gegangen handeln. The Livadia Palace, built in 1910, was Tsar Nicholas II's vacation home. It was an absolute excess. After the Bolshevik Revolution, this symbol of late imperial excess became a sanatorium for collective farm workers. Anaki's Oedipal task then matches that of the revolution, to overcome both father figures, the Tsar and the Jewish father, and create a workers' paradise. A Red Army veteran and a founder of the Yiddish section of the All-Ukrainian Association of Proletarian Writers, Levin was committed to developing a new literature for a new state. One of few published Soviet Yiddish women writers, she created personae who struggle between identities. As Joanna Lisik has discussed in Levin's poetry, Jewish soldiers are loath to bear arms, and women strain to simultaneously raise children in a nation. And Johanna is one of the only scholars who has treated Levin a much deserving poet. Apparent in her Crimean motifs is the extent to which Levin also merges biblical, apocryphal, and modern literary texts to highlight the conflicted identities in the modern Soviet condition. According to Brian Doak, biblical giants have been understood mythically as gods or semi-gods, historically as actual humans of large stature, allegorically representing Canaan's flora or fauna, and sometimes as anti-establishment figures. So David's victory over Goliath is, Doak notes, a suppression of chaos. In Numbers, after Moses sends spies to survey Canaan as a possible homeland, they report that the land flows with milk and honey, but that there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. At the Israelites' refusal to enter Canaan for fear of the Anakim, God condemns the generation to death in the desert. In this very wilderness shall your carcasses fall. Levin's Anaki, like the giants of Canaan, threatens the Israelites' past order, and I owe a debt of gratitude to my colleague, Professor Mira Balberg, for helping me with the biblical texts related to giants, which is just a really fun topic. So at the end of her Crimean motifs, of Levin's Crimean motifs, Anaki asks, "Wie viel kann man sein a Gast?" How long can one be a guest? A familiar quote probably to most of us. This echoes Yehuda Leib Gordon's 1863 Hebrew language poem, "Awake, My People," which Michael Stanislavski has called his most famous paean to enlightenment and integration. Levin, referencing Gordon's poem, alludes to the choices open to Jews in the new Soviet period. Having rejected his father's shtetl existence, Anaki will build Crimea within a new worker state. However, unlike Gordon, who advocates cultural integration into Europe, Levin also uses the nation-building imagery and rhetoric of Zionism. So Levin, with Crimean motifs, employs past and current cultural forms to invent a tradition for a Soviet Jewish space. And here she's also, in some senses, quoting Chaim Nachman Bialik's Metei Midbar from 1897, The Dead of the Desert, where Bialik writes, "By their dark tents they are lain," right, in the sun like Anakim. She seems to be bringing out both these motifs. So with her giant prototype for the new Crimean citizen, she creates a new mythology, one that shifts the Anakim from Canaan to the Soviet Union, adapts Gordon's Jewish assimilationist strategy to the Jewish-Soviet territorialist project, and that reanimates Bialik's sleeping giants in the desert of a Soviet land of milk and honey.
Oh, yeah.
We want to talk about Markish. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
We'll talk about Markish. Okay, so I'm going to say a couple things about Perets Markish's Crimea, which also has this exoticized figure, a different one. If Levin animated a biblical giant to build Soviet Crimea, Markish, the Yiddish poet laureate of the revolution, created in Brothers, Brider, a Jewish war hero to defend the Soviet borders. In the excerpt pre-published in Royte Velt in 1927, Shloime Beil in Crimea, Shloime Beil in Crimea, Markish describes multiple imperial presences in the pre-revolutionary peninsula, including the shaved Englishmen, mustachioed Frenchmen, and so forth, who smoke the golden days in pipes. The most significant foreign presence in Markish's poem, however, is the unnamed Chinese man, a fellow Red Army soldier who loves doves, hates Cossacks, and whose hands smell of cinnamon and tea. Mit Zimmern und mit Tee. In Bredel, the Chinese man is Markish's homeless wanderer. He is Shlomo Bear's double, a former peddler and a representative of an ancient culture. Both traits prove untenable in revolutionary Crimea, also China. Shlomo Bear witnesses his friend's longing for his native China and receives his last breath in Piripur. And I didn't include this quote, but I'll read it. Dreht ihm Shlomo Bear Royce, deckt ihm Shlomo Bear zu. Es hat der Kitayetz a so stil verklärt sich. Es ist etwas voran Teubing in Kitai. So Shlomo Bear turns him over. Shlomo Bear covers him up. The Chinese man so quietly reflected, are there doves in China? In China, we must recall, a nationalist military campaign had been underway since 1926, and mounting tensions between the communists, the nationalist Kuomintang, and various imperial presences in China would lead by the spring of 1927 to massacres of communist demonstrators. Markish's Chinese Bolshevik mirrors the Jewish condition in the USSR while normalizing the Soviet Union as the leader of world revolution. Markish integrated Chinese figures into other poems about Ukraine. Kharkov, first published in Royte Velt in May 1928, describes the migration of peasants and Jews to Kharkiv, the first Soviet, of course, Ukrainian capital. Amid the cosmopolitan mayhem, a Chinezeval, little Chinese man, attempts to perform magic, and this quote is on the screen. Tovarishu, ich kon machen fokussen, ich kon nur nicht machen kein Brot. Comrades, I can make magic tricks, I just can't make any bread. The Chinese sorcerer, like the shtetl Jew, is an outsider who reveals through his outdated magic Kharkiv's relative modernity. He is out of place, and here's the next quote. Bengt gewiss noch sein zerblutigen Kanton, noch Futterlichen Reis, noch sein verloster Kalle, und noch sein Bruder, dem Geketten auf a sloop. He surely longs for his bloody canton, for his fatherly rice, for his abandoned bride, and for his brother, put to death on a post. The Chinese figure is a refugee from Canton, right, Guangzhou, the site of a failed communist uprising in late 1927. The foreigner is eager to join the Soviet world-building project, but he, like the ongoing revolution in China, lags behind. Markish supported the Jewish territorialist project, and yet his Chinese figures, mirroring Russian Jews' historical rootlessness, complicate the idea of a national territorial utopia. If Markish's Chinese refugees enter a larger world-building narrative, they do so from the margins, as wanderers who may never enter the promised land. So I'll turn, if I have a couple of minutes left, to Esther Shumyacher and her own version of a world map. She was not a Soviet citizen, as we know. She offers, however, an important poetic piece of evidence that Crimea had moved to the center of the Soviet Jewish imagination. During the 10 months that she spent in Crimea in 1928-29, Shumyacher completed and published several poems that present the USSR as the culminating point of her years of travel. Shumyacher was born in Gomel and emigrated to Canada with her family before the revolution. She met the enormously successful Yiddish playwright Perets Hirshbeyn in Calgary. The couple married in 1918 and embarked on nearly a decade of world travel together. Both published their literary reflections, as we now know, of Crimea. Hirshbeyn, for the most part, published in the American mainstream newspaper Tog, the Yiddish newspaper Tog, and Shumyacher in Royte Velt, or in a couple of American party-affiliated journals like Homeland. So Shumyacher was definitely publishing in more specifically communist-affiliated venues than her husband. If Levin presented a Jewish outsider as a metaphor for Crimea, and Markish presented the relationship between a Jew and an outsider in defending Crimea, Shumacher's Crimea poems were the culmination of a protracted encounter with the other, and suggest a metaphorical center for a worldwide community of alienated workers and peasants. In May's song, My Lied, published in Velt in 1928, she describes her travels to China and India as a search for like-minded understanding of world order. Ich habe einen Wandel nicht in meine Tag gesehen, von Jangses Fuhle präges diesen Gang. Ich habe im Augentunkele gesucht an Noten Bescheid und habe jeder Eug dem Selb und Hamel klang. I've seen my days of wandering from the Yangtze's broad banks to the Gang. I've sought in dark eyes a familiar interpretation and recognized in that eye the sickle and hammer sound. The Soviet Union promised the solution to the poverty Shumacher witnessed in Asia. In By the Borders of China and India, Shumacher describes destitute, exhausted women, and I cited from this a bit yesterday. Freue Mutter beim Rand von China Ind, es hängen die Korben von ihrer Achseln geloden mit Umetonie, es hängen die drückenden Brüsten wie verteuchten Roglen in Blend von einem durstigen Biest. Wife and mother at the border of China and India, baskets hang from your shoulders laden with sadness and pain. Your breasts hang barren as empty leather flasks in the dazzle of parched waste. Shumacher's borderland subjects are lost between states. She and Hirshbeyn had visited China, Japan, and India in 1926, leaving shortly before the failed uprising of 1927. By the time she arrived in the USSR in 1928, Chinese revolution was in chaos. Shumacher, writing from Crimea about women in China, helped to envision the peninsula as a model for the workers of the world. And marginalized women, I'll just note, appear in some of her Crimea poems as well, such as this one, Gypsies, which is dated 1928. Here's an encounter with a fortune teller. Zigeuner seinen heimgekommen in mein Dorf vergeht. Zigeuner bräuninke mit Beuden und mit drobne Färblich. Mit kinderlich verschmorte, I think that's a typo, mit sepplich und mit Ringen, mit kleblich farbige, mit blanken dicke Zähnen und Augen, gekommen seinen See, wie Herbstvögel in mein Dorf zu singen. Gib, Schwarzäugige, gib, Krasavice, gib deine Hand, die Schneke. Sorry about it, Schneke. A couple of typos. Gypsies came today to my town, Agai, tan brown gypsies with wagons and small horses, with squinting children, with braids and rings, with colorful dresses, with sparkling teeth and eyes. They came like autumn birds to my town to sing, give black eyes, give beautiful girl, give your snowy white hand. So she's, doing a lot of exoticizing here. The gypsies are racialized outsiders, but it's important to note that although the protagonist possesses a snowy white hand, she's also identified as black eyes. In China, Shumacher's persona sought familiarity in dark eyes, and in Crimea, she's identified with an international collective of non-Slavic women who meet and divine the future. Finally, at my last quote, and I'll conclude, in an untitled poem that she dated Agai, Crimea, 1928, Shumacher describes Crimea's Jewish farming colonies as a model for workers around the world. Sehet euch jeden Teile, sehet Gesundheit, mir wollen kommen essen und der quicken sich mit Eier warm und Bräut. Es sind Brüder da beim Wissel und beim Hotzenbreg und bei La Platte und beim Jardens Deures dicke Steg, wo sennen euch mit Kana Eiermi. So, dear Jews, so in good health, we will come to eat and revel in your warm bread. You have brothers here by the Vishal and by the shores of the Hudson, by the La Plata and by the Jordan's age-old path, who envy you your labor. So Shumacher used this poem to close her 1930 book in Schon von Liebschaft, in the Hours of Love. And here the national space embodies an international community again. Agriculture connects Soviet Jews to New York, Argentina, to Jordan. The we that will gather to eat in Crimea is a collective of far-flung workers, peasants, and wanderers. And the source of the warm bread is Jewish labor. So to briefly conclude, Crimea did not become a Jewish homeland. In 1934, Birobidzhan in Russia's Far East became the official Soviet Jewish autonomous region. The age of internationalism ended during World War II. In 1943, Stalin formally dissolved the Communist International. In 1944, members of the Soviet Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee proposed resurrecting a Jewish territory in Crimea. The Politburo administrator Lazar Kaganovich purportedly dismissed the proposal as fantasy, something only actors and poets could come up with. When members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, including Markish, were sentenced to death in 1952, the Crimean affair, Krimskaya Delo, was used as evidence for their alleged treasonous plans. Ironically, although the internationalist world-building mission championed minority nations in the 20s, with the consolidation of Russia's hegemony in the USSR, internationalism was increasingly a pretext for deeming territorial aspirations nationalist. The poetry of the incomplete Jewish Crimean dream recognized the utopian nature of the project. Hannah Levin's Anaki is prepared to move mountains, but the narrator remains alone. Levin closes her poem, Mein Bruder schlug sich mit dem Wind und ich bin als ein Gast, mein Kind. My brother races with the wind and I am still a guest, my child. Markish's Shlomo Ber helps to claim Crimea for the Red Army, but his Chinese comrade in arms dies in the process. And Esther Shumyatra, who saw Crimea as a model for an international community, left the peninsula in 1929. The poetry of Jewish Crimea remains a testament to the Soviet-aligned national projects that did not bear fruit, to the aspirations of a temporary approach to world building when Cantonese sorcerers sought refuge in Kharkiv, when giants roamed Crimea.
Thank you very much for these presentations, which obviously interact with one another, and I'm sure that there will be questions to both our speakers. I was interested because as you were talking, Amelia, I was thinking of the art of Epstein. You know, his giants. It suddenly became interesting to me that he portrayed power and strength. I always thought of his art, these big, strong, beefy-looking Jewish characters in Epstein. I always thought of them as simply a reaction to the idea of Jews as not fitted for the land. But the biblical side of it, I never thought of. That's interesting that that may have actually been an inspiration.
It certainly is also a reaction to the stereotype of the hunched over yeshiva bocher from the shtetl. It's that too, but there is this biblical precedent, right?
And the other thing I was thinking of was Mike Johansson's 1928 book, which deals with Jewish colonies in south of Ukraine, which also sounds very, very similar to this. He has an image of Jews, young Jewish girls riding around on horseback, and the big strong Jew who's the champion wrestler for Ukraine. So everything about it is showing Jews as powerful, muscular, rugged types who are building the new land. But at the same time, and this is my question to you, if I can allow me to ask the first question. At the same time, there was opposition to this idea. If you look at the American newspaper Forward, the New York Forward, there were some very critical articles of this entire project, and very suspicious of this entire project. And it seems to me that people like Johansson were actually propagandists, were actually writing for the idea that Jews should go to the land. So when both of you, when you were speaking, I was thinking, who are they writing against? Is this, was there criticism of this? And were they defending the idea? Because within the wider press, there seems to, Jewish press, Jewish international press, there seems to be an opposition to the very idea of sort of herding Jews into these colonies. Maybe you could comment on that, then we could start a discussion.
I mean, I have thoughts on it. I don't know if you do as well. Do you want to start? Or,
I can start. If you ask, for whom Hirshbeyn was writing, this is, an important issue. Like he was, as I said earlier, he was publishing in Tolkien, he was publishing elsewhere in the world, and for him, he didn't have this kind of Soviet focus as Shkandrij might have, as others people you mentioned, right? The articles in the book form, they were published in Vilna, in the Kletskin Verlag, which was also kind of like mainstream publishing house in Poland. So, as a reference, he was for this kind of he was for transformation of the Jewish life all around the world. He didn't want to. I think he didn't want to Crimea to become a Soviet homeland. For him, it was I was looking at this Argentine visit, and the ideas, the concepts, and the descriptions are very, very much the same. So you have physical strength, you have this, complex interactions with nature, you have this, uneasy interactions with the non-Jewish population. But through time, there is a certain improvement, and a certain understanding, and coming to terms with. I don't think he was involved in propaganda. And he was involved in his private propaganda for designing a Jewish future, right? And
portraying an ideal.
Yeah. And he was appreciating this very beginning of this Jewish utopias that they were sprouting out in different places around the world.
I mean, Crimea, right? As we all know, Crimea is just way too desirable. This is its downfall. Everybody wants it, and the Soviet state wasn't ready to give it to the Jews. I think that the moment came almost a bit too early. It was a left-wing project, and so that's why the forwards would have been skeptical. The forwards was not it was a socialist paper. It wasn't a communist paper, and it was going to be slightly skeptical of anything the Soviet Union did, although I think the forwards and even the Tog started to write a bit more sympathetically in the final years of this project. Very end of the 20s, they started to say, maybe this isn't a bad idea. They started to get on board. The problem was that it was also controversial on the left, because it was still a Jewish territorialist project that was a little bit too heavily supported by Joint and by some Americans that were not obviously supporters of the Soviet Union. And so for the Soviet Union as well, this Crimean project wasn't clearly going to fall under this Soviet ideology, and nobody could fully get behind it. It kind of slipped between. Hirshbeyn, my reading of Hirshbeyn, and I think we have so much that we can talk about, because you know a lot more about him than I do, but my reading of him has always been that he was a centrist for his time. For us, in 2019, far left. But for his time, he was like right there in the middle. He was sort of sympathetic to communism, never held a party card, didn't really publish as much in the venues. His wife, who was like 18 years younger than him, was a little more naturally sympathetic to the Soviet Union and riskier, a bigger risk taker as a writer. She had less to lose. But 1929 hit, there were the uprisings in Palestine, and he's gone. He's done with the communist project. He still supports some kind of territorialist project, though. And he and Esther even support Baby John, despite the fact that they'd mostly broken with the party after the 29 Palestine uprisings. So to me, it was like there was this brief, moment of awakening, and then it all went away. You could go to Baby John.
You can be a communist, you can be a left-winger without holding a party membership, right? I mean, it's your it's what's in your soul, right?
That's right. It's what's in your soul. And you can make that. I really want to hear your case, because I would love to be able to argue that Hirshbeyn's a good communist, and I don't know.
No,
I think he was always a little skeptical. He was willing to go there to live there for a year, but who was he friends with? He was friends with Pinyak, who was also a dissident, something of a dissident. I mean,
you were much farther away in the project than me, because I just at the beginning, and I was still in the process of figuring out who was this guy, right? And also commenting on differences between Shumench and Hirshbeyn, as you said, 18 years older, he had a career of 15 years writing for their talk, and he didn't need to start anything anew as she did, For her it was her first poetry volume, right? And the second one.
Is there first or second?
Yeah, I think first. Yeah. So she was, she wanted to appear, to be appreciated, to be published at all,
Oh yeah, and she was more. I think she was ideologically more there. I think it was generational in part, and he was super famous, and he was wealthy.
I think she was wealthy,
because of him. I mean, her family had money too.
Her family was super wealthy. Yeah. I think she came from a much wealthier, social setting than him. But
we have to also, I think, remember that at this period of time, the national and the international could still, somewhat uncomfortably, but they could combine. And that became impossible in a couple of years. So this is a remarkable moment when you could still be a national communist, where there was still no contradiction, or limited contradiction, it would soon change. There must be questions in the hall, though. Please.
I have a question to both of you. Israel Schlesinger in his Myroslav describes as, while visiting some Ukrainian settlers, he saw portraits of Lenin and Herzl hanging on the wall side by side. Now, how that could be tolerated?
It could be.
In 1927.
Yes. I mean, it's these families were moving from, and this is where I'm kind of getting at with the centrist position. Hirshbeyn was a Zionist. He was not just a communist sympathizer. Where were they in their travels right before here? They were in Palestine. They were hanging out with Bialik. They have letters with Bialik about how excited Bialik is to see them. These guys are not rejecting Palestine in favor of Crimea, and neither were some of the people who came to settle. There was this idea at the time. First of all, there were a lot of left-wing Zionists, even in Palestine as well. But you had people who were like, well, we want a Jewish homeland, but let's also check this place out. But Herzl also represents that. And the images, the giant images, the new Jew are very Zionist. This idea of resurrecting the Anakim.
But I'm talking about Soviet citizens, not about Hirshbeyn or somebody.
Well, so people came from Palestine to settle some of their own kolkhozes. They had some kolkhozes that were specifically for these Palestine retransplanted families.
From Tel Hai, from a Jewish left-wing Zionist,
But they mixed, and so you could be a Zionist and also be somebody who never had gone, had just come directly from the shtetl.
But it was still tolerated in Soviet Union at that time.
Yeah, weird. It was this weird moment in this weird space where this was all folded into this kind of, we're going to tolerate a lot in the building of socialist Jewish kolkhozes in Crimea. Eventually, we're going to make things, much more proletarian in form and content.
The very thing that the Soviet Union accepted, Palestine residents to immigrate. I mean, it shows a certain willingness to accept for a certain time to have Herzl and Lenin next to each other. Because if it wasn't accepted, they wouldn't let them in. And they did, right? I mean, I don't know what are the reasons. I didn't study this historical context, how it was, how it was performed, in the field, but.
But you could also have Herzl and Lenin hanging side by side in a kibbutz in Palestine at the time. So
Well, they were at the time developing autonomous regions, autonomous oblasts, and there was this attempt to develop this regionally specific identities, very much actually supported in Ukraine, in the Soviet Ukraine, because the Soviet Ukraine wanted to be different. It was developing its own Ukrainianization, Yiddishization policies, and it wanted to be, it needed the national minority to be allies in its own developing. So it was a moment in time when one could dream,
Yeah.
and those dreams could be,
The Jordan. Yeah.
those dreams were dreamt by many people, so soon to be cut off.
I would like the reference of this piece that references these two, because that is, I mean, that, like, having somebody actually write that is pretty cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Comments?
На любом языке.
It's not translated into any other language.
Well, I mean, somebody in this room.
I mean, like, not this stuff. I mean, like some plays of Hirshbeyn were translated into like 1980, 1960, 1920, but it's not about this.
Oh, you're wondering if these were translated?
Oh,
Yeah, sorry. No, I misunderstood. Were you?
The Myroslav is not translated into
These, yeah.
any other language.
I mean, Hirshbeyn's plays are mostly translated into English, but not.
I mean, the most successful ones, I guess it's like, five days.
He wrote a lot. He really wrote quite a lot. It's hard to get through Hirshbeyn.
And there is also this, like, you ask about, Zionism, so there is this kind of like breakthrough moment for Hirshbeyn and his Zionism when he comes to Palestine in 1927, and he experiences, and he still has this hope that, Yiddish culture can be an equal partner for Hebrew in Palestine. And then he comes to Haifa, and he sees, Yiddish books being burned, and this is for him a kind of transformative moment when he says, it's not my home. This is kind of like breakthrough. I mean, like, this is a change, when he like stops being socialist Zionist, I would say. Because also, like, when you look at his Vilna period, before immigration to the States, when you look at the publishing houses with whom he was publishing, so he was like, Poale Zion related publishers in Vilna.
Yeah. Schumacher becomes more Zionist later. After Hirshbeyn dies in the 40s, she goes to Palestine, she goes to Israel, and she has a long life.
Could I just ask about the religious side? In the Soviet experiment, Yiddish was okay, Hebrew was not. Jewish identity was okay, but not the religious side of Jewish identity. And if you read the poems of Bajan, Mikola Bajan, who's very sympathetic, on the whole, towards Jews, he's not, at least in his poetry of this period. And this is the period of his greatest poetry, when he was at his best, very avant-garde, fantastic poetry, but nevertheless extremely critical of the religious side of Judaism. Images of the people bowing down, screaming, to their God. This kind of. I mean, it was part of the propaganda around atheism, anti-religious propaganda. How does that play into it all?
Okay, so, and Johanna might have comments on the Levin side. First of all, Levin clearly knew the Bible really well. She was, I believe, schooled in a school for poor Jewish children, but she had a very strong knowledge of Hebrew poetry and of Hebrew texts, but she's mining it through things that might not be so recognizable, except as maybe something of a shibboleth for her readers. Schumacher, none of the stuff she publishes, obviously, in Royte and Velt has anything religious in it. But then in her book, in Schoen von Liebschaft, there's this whole section about Palestine where she is having these religious experiences, and she compares herself to Judith, and she's overwhelmed by seeing these nuns and wondering how their religions differ, and comparing her thought to Muslims. I mean, she's kind of spiritual in this book. I mean, not particularly observant, but spiritual. And she's willing to admit religion as a text. And then Markish, of course, like Bajan, is absolutely, almost anti-Semitic in his treatment of religious Jews. He has other texts about Crimea where he talks about long live these young Jews, and in fact he returns to his image of the heap, of this kind of mound, as saying, well, the old religious Jews are the mound of the past. It's kind of slavky story. So it depends on the person, but certainly for the most revolutionary, they were very anti-religious. And I don't know, maybe Johanna maybe has thoughts about Levin and whether she has explicitly anti-religious poems. I haven't found it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Anti-religious.
Yeah, I think she's more subtle.
She
about
grew up
religion.
in a traditional home.
Yeah.
And I think that it was not anti-religious.
Yeah. No, I mean to the contrary. I think she seems to be very subtly more like Hirshbeyn or someone like that. She's kind of weaving religion in, whereas Markish will go out there and say, "We're done with you."
Well, maybe also it's very important which year, even which month you're talking about,
Yes.
because the campaign ramped up very quickly, and 27 differs from 28, 28 differs from 29. Even the paper in which things are published, if you read the originals, the deterioration in the paper and the way things looked, it sort of mirrors the ideological deterioration as well from that period. I found that fascinating.
Yeah.
Are there any final questions? Because otherwise you get a couple of minutes more for coffee break. Any final questions?
Mariusz, do you think this Hirshbeyn idealized Jewish life in Ukraine from the position of a person who belonged to the economic, social elite? What do you think? This is the point of view?
Yeah, no, this is like interesting, maybe like a broader question. What is the ideal leadership of Hirshbeyn? Because for Hirshbeyn, sometimes I have this, impression that, he didn't recognize the fact that most of the people were religious and poor, Like his world was, was a secular, modern world of I don't know, of this new Jewry that he was imagining and trying to establish. I'm not sure, to what extent his also social status was influencing his writing. I don't know. It's worth thinking, but he wasn't so much bothered, with the economic aspect of the colonization. He was, the transformation was much more to supposed to be social, spiritual than providing a financial basis for Jews, and this other aspect that I mentioned, colonization as a remedy for traumas. This is something that comes up a lot in this, as something against anti-Semitism, as a cure for anti-Semitism. Yeah, it was less. I think it was this spiritual, intellectual aspects were for him more important than kind of providing a proper economic basis for poor shtetl Jews. And he was concerning religion. He got this rabbinical smicha. He was a rabbi, and when being 19, whatever he brought up. He broke up with religion totally, and in his writing he presents religion as kind of darkness, from Finsterkeit in the light, right? And but as I signalized here, there is this thing of of an old man, old Jew, trying to maintain this religious identity, and this raises a certain sympathy of Hirshbeyn. He feels that something is improper in this new social setting in Soviet Union, because we should transform, we should change, we should develop, but let's don't suppress people, let's not make them suffer. I think this is the approach that he might have.
If I can ask you a question, I'm interested in whether Hirshbeyn wrote anything later.
Yeah.
You know, he wrote so fast, right? So after he published these 3 books, did he go back and did he ever question that period of time as far as you know in the later 30s?
You know, 1930s is an interesting period in his life because, you know, like, you think that, you know, like 1930, this is when he publishes his memoirs from the first decade of his life, from the first 2 decades of his life. But, you know, I think he keeps writing, you know, like the second book on Soviet Union, it comes in 1936, which means 7 years afterwards, you know, so and also Royte further, it comes also 1936, which is, you know, which, I mean, he was still grappling, you know, with this, you know, like with the meaning of, you know, Soviet Union for Jews, you know, and
So, if I could just suggest, like, in your quest to figure out how to read his ideology, it might be interesting to look at that distance between the Royte and his earlier first impressions to see subtly what he thinks.
And then, you know, there is another aspect in the late 1930s. He starts to write, you know, this Bovril, you know, this like unknown, like absolutely unknown monumental work, which is, you know, published in 42. You know, when the Jewish world is busy with Holocaust, and no one pays any attention to him. And then he kind of, you know, like, he doesn't look at the Soviet Union anymore. He just looks on America, you know, as a kind of a Jewish homeland, and, you know, if America succeeded to be a proper Jewish home or not, or like a home for Yiddish language as well.
But I 29 was a huge crisis for him. He fell into this deep depression. His friends wrote about this when he was in Warsaw, not even having returned to the U.S. yet. They stopped in Warsaw for a few months, and that was when it all happened. Or I know it maybe even happened before they left. I can't remember. I don't remember the exact month when they left Crimea, but you know, he didn't know where his home
They
was.
left in spring, I think.
So they left before they were in Warsaw when it happened. And it happened the Palestine uprisings were in late August, early September 1929. And he was like, you know, on a couch. Accounts from his friends that he was just like on the couch, you know, like depressed, deeply depressed for a long time after this. And, you know, finally managed to kind of find his fellow, you know, middle way people, right, who were not going to go side with the party and say, because you know, the deep division was that the party called them uprisings, and anybody who wasn't willing to do that had to leave the party. So there was the side that called the Palestine riots uprisings, and the side that called them pogroms. And those that called them pogroms were out of the party, either by their own, you know, desire, because they were pushed out. And there was a splinter journal that started at the time by Levick and Sapira and all of these people, and Schumacher and Hirshbeyn joined them in this journal called Vaad. So that became their kind of way of threading the needle. Vaad. Yeah, it lasted like less than a year, but it's a very high quality literary journal.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Anybody have a final comment? Desperate to have a final comment? If not, then thank you very much to the speakers, and we